This event presents the doctoral dissertation submitted for public examination for the purposes of a doctoral degree in military sciences by Major Olli Teirilä. Tässä julkisessa väitöstilaisuudessa tarkastaa majuri Olli Teirilän sotatieteiden alaan kuuluva väitöskirja. The official opponent is Professor Michael S. Goodman from King's College, London. Virallisena vastaväittäjänä toimii professori Michael S. Goodman King's College, London yliopistosta. My name is Tommi Koivula. As the custos appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defense University, I hereby declare this public examination of a doctoral dissertation as commenced. Minun nimeni on Tommi Koivula. Maanpuolustuskorkeakoulun nimeämän kustoksena julistan väitöstilaisuuden avatuksi. Please be seated. Istukaa, olkaa hyvä.
Honorable Custos, distinguished opponent, ladies and gentlemen. Intelligence matters have progressively become more public, yet paradoxically, intelligence communities have striven to maintain their secretive nature. The intersection of intelligence and publicity has become a contemporary focal point of study due to increasing public awareness and the media's role in shaping perceptions. This research delves into the evolving dynamics between intelligence and publicity, examining the relationship through media reporting on two cases, the preparations for the Iraq War in 2003 and Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013. Intelligence studies is a growing area of research, and with the public dimension granting easier access to a highly interesting subject, it can be said that the methodology is also developing. Simultaneously, more structured research methods are required to keep up with the discipline. Studying a topic that is secret by nature, such as intelligence, is challenging. This means that a robust research design is needed to accommodate and overcome the challenge. In this research, comparative case study offered a sufficient method, providing depth and width for the findings of the study. Detailed checkpoints were chosen to observe progress and development. Evidence of change and differences were found studying the relevant media discourses. This study progressed with two assumptions on the relationship between media and intelligence community. The first assumption was that the reporting on the intelligence matters of Iraq War 2003 preparations paved the way for more critical and in-depth reporting on future cases, such as the Edward Snowden files. The second assumption was that part of the media field, depending on its political and socio-philosophical standpoints, described out-of-control intelligence services as a threat to liberal society, fitting the theoretical framework of Copenhagen School's theory of securitization. As mentioned, despite the inherent secrecy, intelligence can and needs to be studied academically like any other phenomena. There are windows into intelligence and that allow public study for better understanding of contemporary intelligence on its many levels. British historian Christopher Andrew has argued that opening of the intelligence archives for historians and other academics probably changes some of the ideas we have had of, for example, 1900s international relations and diplomacy. He has stated that the more that is discovered about long-term history of intelligence, the more difficult it will be for both policymakers and practitioners to ignore past experience. The public dimension of intelligence can be seen as having three cornerstones: transparency, legality, and legitimacy. In order to study a secret phenomenon, one has to find what is visible and possible to study. These cornerstones provide a window to look into a subject that is mostly invisible to the public eye. Study and public debate contribute to legitimacy. Discussion also promotes transparency, one of the often promoted virtues of the 21st century governance. Legality, the third cornerstone, is the basis for discussion about the other two. Seen, all three can be used as a port of entry to the subject as to how intelligence is seen and functions as information, process, and a tool inside a variety of intelligence cultures. Additionally, to the already mentioned challenges, the possible effects attributable to the researcher's background need to be minimized through methodological choices as well as careful structuring of research questions and consequent research framework. However, no research is completely objective and free of subjective interpretation of evidence and findings. The conclusions are the researcher's opinions based on a comprehensive and systematic study of the subject. Even a meticulous methodological approach is unable to completely ensure that a researcher with different kind of background would have arrived at similar conclusions. The discourses relating to the two cases in 4 main British newspapers were studied in 2 separate yet interacting contexts. The first was built around the theory of securitization and the second on discourse analysis. A multi-level methodological structure was created to bring them into interaction with each other. This was achieved through a 4-step process to make sure all desired aspects were included and given proper emphasis. The process started from background analysis of societal premises with its first step. Second and third steps were the analysis of discourses, both contents and approaches, continued with analysis of their interaction with the traditional depiction of the intelligence cycle. The fourth and final step placed the findings in the context of changing security environment, including both national and international dimensions. The aim of the qualitative study is to understand the phenomena, not merely describe or explain them. Qualitative research is also reliant on interpretations, and these include actual results as well as the process as a whole. From an epistemological point of view, a study like this one deals with an existential question: is it possible to know what the media meant or what was the intent behind their reporting? And would this even be worth studying? Even if the words were there for all to see and read, would there be an explicit or even implicit expression of purpose and ultimate motive to identify? An attempt to understand these motives was a strong driver, and it relied on the premises of regulations and interactions in the social context. The origins of British intelligence and security agencies, as the main pillars of the country's intelligence community are better known, date back to the beginning of the 20th century. Organizations for domestic and foreign intelligence, both Security Service MI5 and Secret Intelligence Service MI6, were established in their early form around the century's first decade. That's when the vast intelligence collection spy machine of the British Empire was finally formalized and organized. From its beginning, the relationship between intelligence community, media and journalists and the public has been an important one for all 3 parties. Dover and Goodman have called this ménage à trois of spooks, hacks and the public. The society gives the intelligence community and media their feet to stand on, whereas the latter two can affect how the relationship walks. This dynamic is of both interest and importance. The development of the dynamics in the intelligence-publicity relationship in the 1900s suggested a broader cultural shift in the attitudes towards the secret state. Since neither history nor competition or conflict ended with the downfall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, intelligence did not end up losing its importance. The 1900s opened doors for deeper and wider interaction and reporting to become evident in the first decades of the new millennium. At the same time, cautious openness and progressive declassification also bolstered the development of intelligence studies in Britain and elsewhere. Regarding the preparations for Iraq war, all 4 newspapers exhibited varying degrees of support, criticism and questioning. with The Guardian and The Independent leaning more towards questioning and criticism. Similar to the case of Iraq, in Snowden case all four media sources, the contents were again varying degrees of support, criticism and questioning regarding intelligence operations, and again The Guardian and The Independent leaning towards critical approach, while The Telegraph and The Times were offering more support to the intelligence community. The two cases created a fruitful setting for comparative study of the dynamics of intelligence-media relationship. Their focus on different aspects of the part played by intelligence in decision-making and national security provided an academically interesting and analytically rewarding insight to media discourses on intelligence. Their different, yet at one point intersecting timelines gave a perspective to changes and development of these discourses. The case of preparations for Iraq War 2003 concentrated heavily on the relationship between intelligence and decision-making, and this was naturally evident in the media reporting as well. Only partly did the discourses touch upon what was happening inside the intelligence community, for example, regarding intelligence collection from dubious sources. The case of Edward Snowden files, on the other hand, was much more intelligence-centered, especially in terms of intelligence collection, as were the media discourses around it. However, viewing intelligence as a part of the decision-making and national security ensemble inevitably meant that the discourses touched upon the basis of state security apparatus as well. While the Iraq case can be seen as a line of near-linear development towards more critical and discourses wider in their criticism, the Snowden case developed in a different way. The media affiliations, or rather presumed stands, probably had much more effect on their chosen discourses involving the case. As the discourses of the two opposite groups developed in their own directions, they prevented a joint linear development that was visible in the Iraq case. As with publicity and transparency, it is highly probable that both cases, Iraq and Snowden, especially when combined in the same time frame, were pivotal drivers for change in oversight mechanisms and for how accountability established and validated. Studying the change in the system before the events and after them has shown development that correlated with media-driven public debate. With this finding, there is enough evidence to argue that media could take credit for a probable, if not even highly probable, effect on the developments. The changes in the secret state and its security environment were substantial. It needed to conform to a new paradigm of legitimacy through regulated publicity, one that wasn't steered or defined by its one-sided regulation, neither formal nor informal regulation. Transparency gives legitimacy only if it's mutually shared. The intelligence community understands why it needs to keep the public informed, and the publicity is received for constructive purposes. The effects of British media's intelligence-related discourses studied by this research had reached beyond Britain, causing similar discussions elsewhere. Richard Aldrich has argued that the British government's most important reason to seek restrictions on media reporting regarding the Snowden case was Britain's continued major role in world affairs. On top of its global interests and far-reaching military operations, British news, in print, broadcast and in digital form, reached and continued to reach a vast global audience. Contrary to expectations, the analysis did not fully support the securitization theory's application to media reporting. While critical elements were present, they manifested in subtle ways, deviating from explicit narratives expected by the theory. The nuanced differences among media outlets indicated diverse reporting frameworks and approaches. Based on these notions, a question arises whether this study was just an invaluable repetition of previous research, combined with already seen approaches. In briefly, my answer is no. This study was a valuable academic confirmation through a comparative study of different events and points in time that those previously held arguments and theories had stood the test of time. Prevailing similarities to earlier studies were not found to be discouraging. Independent verification of prevailing connections and interaction between intelligence, governance and publicity was essential in the formation of a new theory. The review of selected literature served a purpose. It was meant to create a solid foundation for this study. Had the earlier conclusions been found wanting or even erratic, the theory formation would have faced critical challenges, and in all probability, this study would not have been able to repair the damage in order to proceed and reach the conclusions now available. The main achievements of this study are the creation of a methodological structure for qualitative analysis of national intelligence-related discourses and a new theory of intelligence-publicity relationship that supports the legitimacy through regulated publicity paradigm. The so-called K-NID structure showed that it is comprehensive enough to provide systematic understanding of how national intelligence-related public discourses develop over time. From these findings, it was also possible to draft a framework for the new paradigm. Conforming to a new paradigm, the mutually shared transparency gives legitimacy embraced by the intelligence community, and additionally, accountability as well. In theory, the intelligence community needs publicity and transparency for its legitimacy derived from public understanding. The government, for its part, seeks to regulate and control the publicity concerning its secret state. Media uses the publicity to further public knowledge and understanding of what, in the end, still remains partially secret and unknown, hence the intelligence and intelligence community. This theoretical presentation of the intelligence-media relationship in governance context could also be a driver to promote a culture of accountability within intelligence agencies, when publicity is the first step to accountability. This way, media effect is two-directional, finding its purpose for both the public and the intelligence community. It also supports the external influence on development of intelligence culture. This means that the interaction needs to be of a continuous nature, not limited to crisis or conflict situations. A key observation from the study was the progression in media readiness to discuss intelligence matters over time. The mid to late 1900s marked the beginning of this shift, culminating in more extensive and profound public debates during the Iraq and Snowden cases. This study argues that media-driven public discourse significantly influences changes in oversight mechanisms and accountability within intelligence cultures. I ask you upon you, distinguished Professor Goodman, as the opponent appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defense University, to present such comments on my dissertation as you deem appropriate.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's with honour that I examine Olli Teirilä's thesis, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your surname. As a professor of intelligence and international affairs, a former head of Department of War Studies at King's College London, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army Specialist Reserves, someone who spent many years seconded to the British government and a West Ham fan, I feel well qualified in judging your academic achievements and the contribution of this thesis to scholarship. And Olli, I suggest we refer to each other informally from this point onwards. Olli's work is both fascinating and timely. Ever since the intelligence debacle over Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, the role of the intelligence services and their relationship to the media has been questioned extensively and has evolved significantly. This relationship is crucial, of course. In liberal democracies, there has to be accountability of the intelligence services, and the media is just one form of this, even if it's not an official governmental form of accountability. But at the same time, of course, if the intelligence agencies are to remain professional and successful, the vast majority of their work has to be conducted in secret. A careful balance, therefore, has to be sought. Iraq highlighted what happens when the government gets out of control, intentionally using intelligence in a public forum to convince the population of a certain policy choice. In this case, the invasion of a sovereign state based, so we were told at the time, on an accurate intelligence assessment of the threat. Olli's thesis considers just one aspect of this, not the governmental decision-making, which has been dissected in great depth by various official inquiries in the UK, but rather the role played by the media in portraying this intelligence, as well as the relationship between the Prime Minister's office and the intelligence community itself. The second case study, the revelations of the traitor Edward Snowden, that's an objective summary on my behalf of him, is really very different. Here we see an example of a disgruntled American contractor working inside the intelligence community in the US, choosing to publicly release vast amounts of intelligence into the public domain because he didn't agree with what the government was doing. Much of this information concerned the United States, of course, but a significant amount also involved the United Kingdom. And Olli looks at the way in which these disclosures provided by Snowden were reported in the UK press at the time and afterwards. As Olli states in his thesis, the academic study of intelligence is a broad and varied subject, encompassing different methodological disciplines, subject matter, and geographical perspectives. The thesis, I would argue, and I think he agrees, is situated in two different areas of intelligence studies. The first is subject-specific. There's a small literature that focuses on the relationship between the intelligence community and the media, and Olli places his thesis within that subject area. As technology has changed, so too has the media's portrayal of and its interaction with the intelligence world. A book I edited, which Olli very kindly cited back in 2010, was novel on this subject in many ways, but what's interesting, looking back 14 years later, is just how out of date it is already. There was no mention in 2010, for instance, of social media, which didn't really exist back then, so the landscape has changed very significantly. And although Olli's case studies largely predate this technological change, towards the end of the thesis he does reflect on the subject more broadly and how it has evolved since. The other area where he places his thesis is methodological. One of the greatest challenges still facing the academic study of intelligence is, in the view of one academic, the fact that it is under-theorized. Most of the literature tends to be empirical, archival-based historical scholarship. There is a growing body of social scientific theoretical scholarship, and now an even more extreme and far less useful, although we will discuss this, critical intelligence studies literature. The two disciplines of social and political science and humanities in this area rarely meet. Olli attempts to do this by placing his empirical treatment of the media within a social constructivist framework. So in summary, it's with great delight I stand before Olli, his supervisors, his colleagues, his friends and his family, and offer my examination of the thesis. Thank you. So now I'm told I have to give at least 90 minutes worth of interrogation without waterboarding of the thesis. So Olli, tell me, the thesis obviously concerns a country you're fond of, but you're not from. It involves a time period which it always strikes me that university students and young army cadets were born after these things happened. So how did you get interested in these two subjects?
Okay, to start from the very source of my interest towards this topic was that in 2011 I started working at the Department of Strategic and Defense Studies, and at that time and age, the discussion on the Iraq War was already in its hindsight phase, and during my tenure at the university, the Snowden revelations took place. And in a way, they involved all of us working in the security studies section. So that is one of the reasons that I picked on these cases, that I was there studying similar events and living through them at the time. And from my point of view, from an academic point of view, I found it easier to handle cases that were not too close to home, but events that there was a lot of reporting on, that there was an abundance of information available on both cases. Of course, some of it was already in hindsight so it was a bit more critical than for example in the Iraq case than it was in the Snowden case at the time. But starting these studies a few years afterwards, after the Snowden case actually surfaced, I think I had good premises for the study from that point of view.
And why the focus on the UK and not the US, for instance?
Well, there are a couple of reasons to go for a UK approach. First of all, it was easy to pick a case or two cases from the Anglosphere. Obvious reasons that the language, I was familiar with English, so it was easier than, for example, to proceed with some other language. And as already in the intelligence studies field, there was a lot already going on in the Anglosphere, both in the US and Britain. But in the end, I decided that the US might have provided me with a bit too much of data to work on. The abundance might have been overwhelming, what there was an offer from the US side. And to be honest, I wasn't that well informed of the US structures to get interested even in the cases. And the second one was that, of course, Britain, while in those days still in the EU, the events in Britain were likely to have some kind of effect on the European scene, as well as, of course, then Finland as a part of Europe as well. So that's why I chose originally to go with the British approach on the study.
Okay, thanks. What I'd like to do is I've sort of divided up my questions into different sections: general, literature review, methodology, case studies, and then conclusions. And they will overlap, and we will be going back and forth in the thesis. But that's how I'd like to sort of structure it slightly. So perhaps you can tell us, a PhD is all about an original contribution to scholarship. So what is original about your thesis?
That is one of the first things that I was basically what my professors were scrutinizing. First of all, the idea of intelligence as a security issue. Already it's normal. The intelligence services are part of the security apparatus, so that I remember being questioned by then professor of strategic studies that what is new about this one? And I had to explain in length how I was looking at the intelligence services from the media perspective, whereas the securitization theory would be involving actually the media and not coming from the media side and not the intelligence services. Whereas usually when, for example, in the original, when you did read the origins of securitization theory, for example, it's always how the state or politicians are trying to make some issue into a security issue. So this was actually working the other way around, which in my view was a novelty issue. Of course, it has been done since, and it had been done at the time as well to a certain extent. But I tried to find a new approach to intelligence services, which was my main thing. I wanted to do intelligence studies. So that was one, and placing the intelligence studies into an intersection of discourse analysis and securitization theory. I also managed to keep my study in the realm of the strategic and security policy studies, which was my main goal, to keep it in those limits, so that I would actually be able to do it here in the National Defense University and to the strategic studies in the strategic studies discipline.
So would you argue your great contribution then is methodological rather than empirical?
I would say that I would say that the methodology is when I'm hoping that if somebody else picks something out of my thesis that they would try somewhere, it would be the method, because that is something tangible that you can actually try somewhere else.
Okay.
As well.
I want to come back to some of these points in a little bit. So if you had to, the Americans refer to it as an elevator pitch. You know, if you've got 1 minute between floors, how do you sell your thesis to someone? Say, read this, it's really interesting, and here is the one contribution it makes, my main argument.
I've had to do that while walking stairs in an international conference once, because somebody asked me, so what's new about your study? And it comes back to what you were saying already in your first notes, that intelligence studies has much been lacking theoretical insights. And this is one way of offering the intelligence studies something theoretical, that there is something non-historical that you can apply to studying some things of intelligence services, intelligence community, intelligence cultures, that it is possible to take some theories of, for example, social constructivist nature and apply them in intelligence studies. That might sound very boring to many, but when in an academic conference, that is something that people always look for, that you have some kind of theoretical approach to your paper, not just telling it how you think things were or things are going to be.
Yeah. Well, everyone is awake so far, so far so good. I mean, some of these things I want to come back to as we go through, and I'm afraid we will be sort of jumping back and forth with subject matter and other things. But tell me, what is the closest sort of account book or anything else that exists to this subject, and how is your research different?
I came across a few that had done, for example, about politicization or securitization of both the Snowden case and Iraq case. But the biggest thing differing was that I was using a comparative method. I was actually taking two cases and comparing them to each other, whereas many of the others had only pinpointing on one case, doing an in-depth study of a singular case. So that was kind of, and reading, from example, many of the intelligence studies previous scholars, for example, Philip Davis has always tried to get everyone into comparative studies to get more robust designs for the studies to compare situations.
Okay. Now, I want to just focus on the title of the thesis for a moment. Development of Intelligence-Media Relationship in Britain. Now, if I was being sort of critical of this, I would say, actually, your thesis is not about that relationship, because it's one-dimensional. It's the media perspective on government. It's not about the government's perspective of the media. So how would you respond to that? How would you say this is about a relationship? Because my contention would be that this is not about a relationship.
Two things about this one. I think, first of all, is the context. The two cases are very media specific. They are discussing the events or the cases from a media perspective. What was the media saying? Why were they doing it? But when you look at how the thesis is constructed, from going into the beginning of the 1900s and creating how the society regarding media and intelligence community in Britain was previously, it is all based on the relationship between publicity and intelligence community. And the case studies add to this view and bring it, like then the title is saying, and beyond. So it is saying that how these two cases changed that relationship. And that is how I would argue the title. And to be honest, the subtitle was changed 2 minutes before somebody pressed send at the university's halls. It used to be development of intelligence-related discourses in Britain, but intentionally wanted the emphasis to be on the relationship, on the dynamics of intelligence-publicity relationship. Maybe that is more interesting for anyone who sees the book or the book cover anywhere, and okay, this is about something much more than just the discourses. The discourses are an evidence of how the relationship is evolving and is still evolving.
Let me ask you one of the things you just mentioned. You use the words media and publicity, and at various points in this you use publicity, and then it sort of gets quietly dropped after the first couple of chapters, and you then go into media. How do you define them? How do you refer to them in here? What's the difference between the media and publicity?
In the context of this study, I used the term media when I was talking about the specific primary sources that I was studying. So the newspapers, the four main newspapers, The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph, and The Times, I referred to them as media. And then around that case study, I used publicity to talk about the bigger image, the bigger picture, the wider concept of how intelligence works. And then in publicity, there's also not only the newspapers, but academics writing articles about intelligence communities, all the blogs or what you have nowadays. So it's a wider perspective when I'm speaking about publicity compared to just the media, which in this case I define to be just the four main news media that were used as the case in the case studies.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll come back to that again a little bit more. So on page 1 or page I, you say the study suggested that media-driven public discourse significantly changes in oversight mechanisms and accountability within intelligence communities, and the media is often held up as one of the sort of informal modes of a democracy has of oversight and of accountability. And you refer to these issues of accountability, oversight, on and off through the thesis, but it's not a core element of the thesis. Did that change as you were going through the thesis? Were you going to talk more about oversight and accountability, or how do you view this relationship in Britain? And I suppose we can limit it to the time periods, and we can come back to the later periods afterwards.
From this study's point, or from the point of view of this study, I kept those, both accountability and oversight, as an external things, that they were something where the changes were manifesting. When media was, for example, in the Snowden case, media was discussing how intelligence collection, for example, is operated, how the oversight is done on that one, and when going back to see and trying to see what effects the media discourses might have had, I was then referring to the changes, for example, in oversight mechanisms, where I noticed that the officials came out in public saying that, okay, we have changed this and this thing after the Snowden revelations. So I was using them as sort of an evidence of the effects of the media discourses, both oversight mechanisms, which were a bit easier to find the evidence, and then accountability is such a wide phenomenon that it was hanging on while the thesis was proceeding, and in the end, in the conclusions, mostly I bring it together that, okay, this all of these findings about how publicity affects the intelligence community, it is likely to have also effects on how accountability within the services, in the oversight mechanisms, how those are developing.
But you sort of don't really look at that in a concrete fashion in the thesis, how it evolved over time.
Not within these pages. No, I do have another article in the works, so that is a different thing. But not in the context of this one. It is referred to a couple of times.
Okay, you on page 2, Roman numerals, page 2. You say the thesis concludes that the intelligence community requires publicity for legitimacy. The government seeks control over the narrative and the media uses publicity to enhance public understanding, forming a delicate balance crucial for preventing intelligence failures from becoming existential threats to society. Always sounds good when you read it loud.
And writing.
And writing, yeah. But I'm interested. So this idea, the bit I sort of highlighted in that sentence, the government seeks control over the narrative. Can you explain that a bit more? Do you really believe that?
I guess I have to say I do. But this stems back to the previous century, especially in Britain, when first, after the Second World War, the intelligence community was frightened a bit when the first journalists were asking that can we write on, for example, signals intelligence, how it was done against the Germans during the World War. Mm-hmm. And everyone was thinking that why is anyone interested in this one? And secondly, is this dangerous to the intelligence community that somebody writes about us? Yeah. And from this point of view, well, this proves the point that there was a need for the officials and the so-called secret state to somehow regulate what is being said about the services, how they conduct their operations. So there was like I think Aldrich was saying at some point that they tried to regulate it is like a proactive regulation that government is trying to do, giving the tidbits to the journalists, and they'll be happy with that one instead of all open access to everything. But as we know, in all walks of life, trying to achieve control of something is extremely difficult. And as things developed in the last 100 years, the government came to a conclusion that actually they cannot do it, that they cannot force control over something that is supposed to be working on its own in a liberal democracy, so that it was counter-effective, in fact, the forceful regulation of what anyone was writing. In Britain especially, that there were the Official Secrets Act that were proper law, written in law.
Still is, yeah.
Regulative regulations, but mostly the British state tried to use informal ways of directing what was said publicly about the secret state, how it operates, how intelligence services operate, how intelligence collected. There were a few failures from both sides in this case, but it kind of developed from a proper defensive stand into understanding that, okay, the control needs to have something, mutual understanding to actually outlive the problems.
Yeah, there's a nice phrase that people who work in government say, government either works through conspiracy or cock-up. Can a government, and I'm sure the Finnish government is very different, of course, but can a government really keep secret things secret? Yeah. And people who agree with that say, look at the World War II secret of the breaking of the German codes. In the UK, it was secret for 30 years. And the number of people that knew about this were in the thousands at the time, that had aspects, access to one element or another. So people who argue that governments can keep these secrets use that as an example. But of course, that was a very long time ago. The world was very different. People's view of these things was very different. The media's role in this was very different. How did it change between, Iraq 2003, Snowden some years later, and perhaps today? How has this relationship, this idea that governments control our narrative? You mentioned Aldrich. He wrote an article some years ago saying that governments manipulate our understanding of the past because they choose what archival releases to make, which I think is a bit one-dimensional. But what is your view of this?
To come to the last point first, there's also a historian, Christopher Andrew, who has said that so much is still kept hidden that we actually don't have a proper image of what happened in the last 100 years in international relations, because a significant part of the diplomacy and international relations is still kept hidden. which is the intelligence actions that the governments who were using, the leaders were using to achieve, to reduce their ignorance of things, or to achieve upper hand on their challengers or opponents. So that is also coming to your last point, that we don't have the whole image yet, and probably never will. So it is based muchly on assumptions on how things are operated and what could have been the result. But coming to the later scenarios between the Iraq case and Snowden, there's I think it's Canadian Tony Campbell who has written about the change of paradigm in the relationship between intelligence community and media. He's saying that prior to the 9/11, there was an oversight paradigm where media and publicity were thought that, okay, they are like the fourth watchdog, that if proper oversight mechanisms fail, the media will take care of for example, the intelligence failures. They will bring them out. But after 9/11, it was thought that the situation is such that the two actors, intelligence community and the vast media, by then can't work completely alone in their own corners. And Campbell was referring that there's like a new paradigm of like at arm's length, careful collaboration between the two. That let's see what you have between media and intelligence, and let's see if we can exchange some information. So that was developing there. And then when coming to the next cases, the intelligence community was a bit not surprised probably, but took a step back and, okay, let's be a bit more careful about what we share with the media, and keeping the media at an arm's length most of the time. So very, very careful about what is made public into.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting changes, we have something in the UK called the D-Notice system, the Defence Advisory, and there are various things which historically the media were not allowed to report on, anything to do with nuclear weapons, special forces, or the intelligence agencies, several others. And so if you go back to the sort of Cold War period, the editors of the newspapers you cite would have had a relationship with the D-Notice secretary, who was always a retired senior military official, and they would be gently lent on and said, don't publish this. And they would say, in the greater national good, we shall not publish this. But of course, that all began to change. Fast forward to the early 2000s, while that system still exists, it's much more complex because the media landscape has grown. It's not just sort of newspapers. Now you have lots of websites and other things, the foreign broadcasters that don't have to abide by these sorts of agreements. And so that system is sort of defunct and dead. And so there's no control over these things, even though from a legal perspective, you can still be prosecuted under the Official Secret Act, even if you've not signed it, so the media can get in trouble. I had a question that followed from that, and I've now totally forgotten it. So I'll just leave that as a statement.
Okay, I'll pick up from that one. Talking about the defense notice system, I think I wrote it already in the introduction, that this whole story that is within these pages is basically a story about the British Old Boys Club. That 100 years ago from now, when Britain realized that they need a much more massive civil service system, they need much more people in civil service. By then, basically, public school system graduates decided that, okay, we can't rely on these peasants and lower class people coming into civil service to abide by the rules that we have, gentlemen's rules between ourselves. So that's when, for example, the D-Notice system came into power, that they created a system where informally the media would ask the D-Notice committee that, can we publish this? And then the committee would either say the reasons into yes or no. And as we've seen, there was even a case in mid 1960s where in a bit shady way, one of the journalists was about to write about how signals intelligence was used in those days, and he asked the D-Notice Committee secretary that, okay, can we do this? And Captain Lowen, I think he was at the time, we're not sure if he gave a proper answer or somebody misunderstood somewhere, but the Daily Express that had the story, they went and published it, much to the fury of the Prime Minister, who thought that this should have never been published. And the whole fracas then around the D-Notice system, that who said, he said, not he said, she said this time around. And it went around giving not a bad reputation, but it raised concern within media about how does this D-Notice system work. If it's informal, that can either side rely on a system like that? And as you said, it has survived until now in existence. But it's one manifestation of the secret state's attempts to actually try to keep the relationship with media going on in informal ways, instead of having everything written into a law and threatening anyone with the law if they publish something. So it's like a preemptive way of trying to negotiate at what is publishable and what is not.
I'd like to shift tack slightly and sort of step back slightly and think about the literature review elements of all of this. You talk about on page 5 the general state of intelligence studies as a discipline, and you say part of this is the purpose of the study. Only in this way can it truly become and validate its place, this is intelligence studies, as an independent discipline among academic studies. So just stepping back slightly from the detail here, how do you view intelligence studies as a subject today?
Narrow. It is attending many of the conferences where they do have intelligence sections. There's a variety of topics that are discussed. That it's on a good footing topic-wise. There are many different kinds of topics, but the problem is, even though it's getting better from an academic point of view, the way of handling those topics, of approaching the topics, and using, for example, interdisciplinary approaches is still a bit lacking. In many cases, I refer to many of the historians, for example, saying that international relations scholars have not been interested in intelligence studies for some reason. The reason could be that there's just not enough data available for them. But as international relations theory has been thriving for a long time, there are new approaches coming all the time. The same thing hasn't been happening with intelligence studies. It's still mostly history studies. So that is one thing that for every attempt to include, to cross intelligence studies with others, for example, security studies theories or social studies theories, when they serve a purpose, when it's not done just for the sake of let's mix a bit of gender studies into this one, let's mix a bit of whatnot studies into the mix. When it serves a purpose to find something new about the subject, then it's validating the approaches, and that is what makes the discipline grow as well.
So why has that not effectively happened up until now?
As I said, I think one of the reasons is that the scholars of other disciplines are a bit afraid to touch the intelligence topics, either for reasons that they'll be slapped with a classification, or they're told not to do it, or there's just not enough information available, people think, which is not correct. And I think there is, I'm not sure if it's allergy from the intelligence studies people to touch the other theories to employ them in intelligence studies. That could be as well.
I mean, I'm definitely allergic to theory, and I work in an interdisciplinary department. All of my degrees have been between 2 departments, and every time I come near theory, I get a rash and go, "This is rubbish," and I hate it. So why do people like me that are allergic to this? Why do we need the theory? I remain to be convinced how it will help us.
I think it will give more perspectives on the matter, and to especially if you have a topic that is as difficult to deal with as intelligence. But when you make it into a theoretical approach, it's easier to handle it. You don't have to touch, for example, the contemporary issues of what a government is doing. When you take a step back and look at it as a whole, as a topic, how it functions, in that way it is likely to help.
So I just need some cream for the rash, basically.
Basically, yeah.
So on page 21, for instance, you cite this article by Scott and Jackson, Study of Intelligence in Theory and Practice. It's 20 years old, so people have been talking about this for quite a long time, and it still hasn't happened. Has the subject matter at least moved on a little bit since then? It has.
The subject matter, when talking about academic studies of intelligence, has grown wider a lot.
Yeah.
The topics are much more varied than they were, and one of the things I remember discussing with both Tommy and my previous professor, that looking at the main literature sources that I have, they're at least 10 years old, most of them. Does this mean that nothing interesting or nothing of value has been written since? But in my opinion, what I found is that these are still the very basic level studies that still matter today.
Yeah.
Were actually written 10 to 15 years ago, and they are very good. They're a solid base for new studies. And of course, I hope that it doesn't take 10 to 15 years for anyone to quote my book, but in the same way that there's little by little coming new things. And I think in the 20s there have been more studies that have something to give in intelligence studies, rather than in the for example 2015 to 2020 time frame.
And now we find ourselves almost with the old-fashioned division, if you like, between historical empirical approaches and methodological approaches, and no sort of crossover. Now we have this new kid on the block, critical intelligence studies. What's your view of that literature?
I have been in the middle of academic battle between traditional theorists and the scholars of critical intelligence studies, and I had to ponder when doing my research. It was one of the final chapters that I wrote. That where does my study stand on this issue, and how it relates into the critical intelligence studies? The critical intelligence studies has much talked about how we need to get off the state-centric topics. We have to have something more than the state in the middle of intelligence studies. That is one. We need a wider, just like the security studies has grown wider in topics and objects and subjects. So the same was wanted from the intelligence studies. And then there's the other part where the scholars are wanting that there is a much more varied theoretical basis applied to intelligence studies. And the problem with that one is, as it has been argued by other scholars as well, is that some of those theories are applied just because somebody wants to apply them. They might not be applicable as such, or the results that they produce are hard to validate. So that is, of course, nobody says that you can't do that. Nobody tells you that you can't apply that theory. It's okay to do it, but it might not bring anything to the table for the actual discipline. And one argument also from the scholars of critical intelligence studies has been that the intelligence studies has been and still is too much practitioner focused. That when we're doing intelligence studies, the focus is always to make better practices for intelligence communities, better practices for the governments that are controlling the intelligence services. So practitioner perspectives is what they wanted to change. It should be more about general understanding. But for example, in this one, even though the theory in the end is of general understanding, but it is also written in the way that it is giving something on the practical side. So in that way, I'm very careful that the next time when I go to a conference, I won't be thrown tomatoes at from either side of the scholars. But it is not the intention to be vaguely in the middle. But I do say that, okay, this is not a critical intelligence studies research.
It reminds me of that great quote by Kissinger. Academic debates are so bitter because the stakes are so low. We should never forget that.
Could very well be.
On the literature review in the thesis, I mean, if I'm being a little bit critical, I think sometimes you cite sources, but you don't really engage with them properly, and you don't really talk about what the publications are about. So, for instance, on page 12, you cite books by, Failing Intelligence by Brian Jones, The Snowden Files by Luke Harding, No Place to Hide by Glenn Greenwald, and they don't necessarily figure again in the thesis. Now, all three of those, of course, are very one-dimensional, totally biased sources. So, how do you relate those into your thesis? Because I think they're not really referred to again, but you sort of haven't really critically engaged with their arguments.
The approach on those exact three publications, which one of them dealt with the Iraq case and then two on the Snowden case.
Yeah.
These were part of what I call secondary sources. I used a lot of secondary sources to frame, for example, the timeline. To create, when I was getting acquainted with the cases, I needed to read a bit more. I didn't start off from the newspapers, what they were saying. I started off by getting acquainted with the cases, how they developed, what were the meaningful points in time that were relevant for the study. So, for example, all these three were just used as a background information of at what point in time something happened in the cases that would be relevant for me to check what the media was saying at this point. And that's how I created both two cases. Have a set of 4 checkpoints, and I use these checkpoints as the deep dives into the media discourses. I didn't, for example, in the Iraq case, where the first events were in September 2002, and then the Chilcot report is published nearly 14 years later. So I didn't follow the whole 14 years of spanning time, but I did 4 incursions into the timeline. And for that creation of those checkpoints, I used, for example, the Brian Jones's Failing Intelligence, which is quite intriguing piece to read, but I didn't use it as insightful to the conclusions, but just to use it as setting the table for the study.
Yeah, Jones was a bitter man, of course. It was a defence of defence intelligence. What about, for instance, on page 33, you refer to a book written by some Finns, Journalism and the NSA Revelations, people from the University of Tampere, which Tommy tells me is the best university in the best city in the world. What do that's referred to again just in sort of passing, if you like, and you don't really tell us what the conclusions are of those authors and how your research differs to what they've come up with. So on that particular example, for instance, how does your work differ?
I have to admit that this one was mostly name dropping, and for a reason that doing a study of Anglosphere, I wanted to show that the study of intelligence is not as Anglospheric centered anymore. That we have publications of like this was of quite wide input, that they are being published elsewhere, and I wanted to kind of highlight that actually in Finland also there has been a contribution to this side of intelligence studies, and in a way I admit I don't return to this one, but it was sort of like I was leaning back on that. I'm not the first Finn to do a thing like this, that there have been studies in similar cases before, and just to prove.
Yeah, I suppose my broader point really is that I think, you know, if you were doing this again, which I'm sure you won't, but if you were to do this again, I think these sources needed to be a bit more critically engaged with, and it's not just citing them to show that you're very clever and you know they exist, but it's saying, here is the existing literature, here are the arguments, here are the gaps, and this is the gap that my original contribution fits. And that was sometimes lacking a little bit, I think, in the literature review.
To my defense, I did return to them in the latter part of the study, and I revisit the ones that I picked out to be the most important ones. So I refer to, or I mirror my findings to those publications, saying that, okay, this is what they said originally. For example, I think it's Lomas Award were saying that, okay, no matter how much information you push to the public, it doesn't matter that they are doing something else. The information available, it's not the problem. And I come back to that one in my arguments in latter parts, I think in chapter 8, and I revisit the important ones of the literature and mirror them on my findings if they held or if I find contracting or conflicting findings to them.
Okay. I'd like to move now onto the methodology of the thesis. What was the biggest challenge you found in researching this thesis?
I think the biggest one was before eventually deciding that, okay, this is doable from this angle, finding the right theory that I wanted to apply, knowing that, okay, on a study of this magnitude, being a doctoral study, I need to be strong on the method side. So I wanted to find something that was viable, something that was useful, something that I understood from my point. I didn't want to pick a method or a theoretical approach that was somehow weird or unknown to me, very unfamiliar. But it took me a while to set on the securitization theory. So that took me some time, and then to figure out how to apply. I knew I wanted to study what happened in the Iraq case, what happened in the Snowden case. I had a vision already. That, okay, I want to see what was public about those cases and intelligence. And then the application, which you saw then in the end, in the four-step method or the structure, methodological structure. So coming up with that one was hard in the beginning. But I have to say that when I went over that hill and I had the four-step structure alive, it was easy then to pick the pieces. Okay, now I'm researching for this step. Let's do this one. And so it was easy to go step by step after that one was set.
So let's pick up on that a little bit. So for those of us who are not familiar with it, what is securitization theory?
All right, the securitization theory means that an actor takes an issue that is not in the realm of public speech, is not publicly contended or not portrayed as a security issue. This is the very basic explanation of the theory of securitization. For example, a politician can take a subject, be it immigration, be it something that is environmental, and speak about it in a way that it is a security threat, usually to the state. And then in that case, what it actually, according to the theory, the Copenhagen School's theory, you bring it into the discussion, you portray it as something that needs special measures allowed for the government to tackle that problem. So it needs to start off that you have some issue. You'd start talking about, you bring into the political sphere, that, okay, we need to talk about this one. It is a security threat to somebody. Then you need to start offering that, okay, we need to do something. We need an alternative thing to do about this. this issue, handled it with possibly with emergency regulations, and that's how a thing becomes securitized. It becomes a security issue, no matter it originally was.
So is there a difference? I mean, your two case studies are very different in many ways, and I want to come back to them in a moment, but just in this context. You know, one of them, Iraq, the British government at the time would say the Iraqi state poses a threat to the UK, therefore we have to deal with it. But you can make an argument, and various reports said this afterwards, had you come up with a list of, you know, the threats to the UK, Iraq would not have been number one or number two or number three, or it'd been further down the list. So you could make an argument, I think, that Iraq was created as a security threat. Compare that to Snowden. You know, whether you think he's a terrorist or a traitor or a freedom fighter, whatever, you know, he revealed all of this information that he had access to, and he chose to go public with it. So so what you have is the first scenario where the government almost creates it, you could say, and certainly the release of the dossier is a government creation. The other one is the government reacting to something which has all of a sudden become public knowledge. How does securitization theory differ when we think about those two scenarios?
Well, this was an interesting approach because much has been written and studied about the two cases, and for example, like you said, the Iraq case has been securitized a long time ago by the British government, saying that Iraq is with its presumed weapons of mass destruction is a security threat, even within 45 minutes, and so my like novelty approach was that I wasn't studying if Iraq was made into a security issue. I was studying that whether media was saying that actually the intelligence services were the problem, they were the security threat in this case. And coming to Snowden, where many politicians, for example in Britain, were saying that Snowden is the threat. This whistleblower is the security threat to our government actions, the actions of the secret state. The intelligence community cannot bear to have its secrets spread out like Snowden did. So in a way, the setting of the two cases was in a way fruitful to begin with, that they were like mirroring each other in the way that the government was dealing with, and then to look at, well, what did the media actually try to say? Was media trying to say that however intelligence community was acting in regards to the Iraq case, that were they too out of control? Are they actually a threat? The way they act, and then in the same way, checking that if media was saying the same thing about intelligence services regarding Snowden case, did Edward Snowden publish something that the public should be worried about, especially that the intelligence services are doing something that is a security threat to the society, an existential security.
Existential threat.
Especially the existential was a word when studying the securitization theory. The word existential comes up a lot.
Yeah.
So it means the gravity of the threat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my colleagues at King's who works in this sort of area, whenever she writes about security, she has the word in brackets beforehand. And her argument, if I paraphrase it in a very simplistic way, because that's, you know, how my non-theory brain deals with these things, she would say that when the government focuses on security topics, it creates insecurity as a response, which is why you have this thing in brackets. Is that a view you agree with? And if, you know, whether your answer is yes or no, what is the role of the media in that context?
Well, to be honest, wearing this uniform,
you create insecurity.
That does wearing a uniform, bringing, for example, military into media, military responding to 10 o'clock news, not the 9 o'clock news, insights in a uniform. Are they creating feelings of insecurity as such, even if they're saying that there is no immediate threat? But is that in the same way? It might be argued that is it increasing? But then again, we come back to the objective view, that subjective view, whoever is watching those news, how do they feel about seeing uniforms? The same as it goes that in Finland, for example, the discussion that should conscripts, when they go on holiday, should they be wearing their uniforms? That what kind of feeling does that create? So we come. Does it increase security, or does it increase feeling of insecurity, seeing more soldiers on the street? So we come to this, like not sentimental, but a bit subjective issue.
Yeah, totally. Just a final question on securitization theory. On page 44, your penultimate paragraph. Additionally, some scholars have expressed reservations. That paragraph. You talk there. I mean, I could be very picky and say that when you refer to some scholars and critics, you don't actually reference who you mean. But let's leave that to one side. So there are clearly some people who don't like securitization theory. My question is, what's your view of that? Because obviously you use it, so you like it, and you say that was the great sort of methodological breakthrough, as seeing what a bunch of Danes thought about security and thinking that's the answer to the future. But is it without its weaknesses?
Well, it starts off by saying that some might wear, for example, a tight uniform, but they don't like it. But the application of the theory has been criticized. That, for example, the theory itself is making a security issue of something. So in itself, when the theory was created, that it was like starting at the snowball rolling. That in fact, talking about how something is a security issue is securitization. It's theoretically the same issue. But I do think that from the point of view that I applied it in this one, it works. You can, if you have the topic or the object that you're studying is such that you can distance yourself from it, it is easy to apply. And the methods that they have, for example, Lene Hansen, very, very famous scholar on securitization theory, has outlaid a very, very simple guidelines to follow when you want to apply the theory. But as such, it's a problematic because it is kind of sometimes used as a counter to counter when somebody is actually trying to make a security issue of something. You can come and say that, I know that I have a theory why you're doing this. So in a way, it's another hammer to use against whoever is doing the securitization.
Yeah, and then on page 43, you then sort of write about how, in a practical sense, I suppose, you apply the theory to the case studies. And you've got the 4 factors of theory of securitization in a slightly updated fashion. Your updates?
The update was that usually when talking about the theory, that it is very state-centric in a way that the actor is usually either a prime minister like Tony Blair or a state voice. Yeah. So I tried to swivel that around to make it that, now we're having somebody's trying to make the state actor the existential security issue. So in that way I updated a bit, and but in a way, for example, the last part, that you do need for the theory to work and to be complete, you do need an audience to speak about it. So the audience remains the same. It's still the public, unless you're trying to do a small cabinet thing where the public wouldn't matter. But in this case, the audience was the same as with when Blair was, for example, trying to securitize Iraq into a security threat for Britain. Yeah, in the same way that I was trying to see if the media was handling the issues concerning the case, how the case was dealt with, and they were speaking to the public as well.
So in a sort of practical sense, just to make sure I've understood it correctly, on page 43 again, you've got these 6 research questions in italics. Who are the main actors, etc., as you can see there. And then if you skip forward to page 47, you've got your qualitative analysis of national intelligence-related discourses. I want to come back to the word discourse in a minute. But and so then when you go through your analyses of the newspapers and you categorise them with explanatory, questioning, supportive, critical. How do you relate, those questions with your canid? Is that how you called it? Your model? Because at one level they're not quite answering the same thing. Obviously the subject matter is the same, and the broader conclusions, reflect both. But you have very, very specific research questions there, and then the analysis does something slightly different.
Well, the canid, as I call it, I couldn't fit feline, so I had to use canid in this one. The securitization theory is a part of the structure, a part of the canid structure. With having the 4 steps, in the first step you look at what was before, what were the societal premises for the discourses to develop between, or intelligence-related discourses in a society. That was the first step. Then moving on, there were the 2 steps that had to do with discourse analysis. Mm-hmm. I was checking what was said about the media. I was analyzing that, okay, what kind of contents were they saying, what kind of approach did the media have, and then the third part, checking, okay, which parts of the traditional intelligence cycle they touched upon. And then only in the 4th part, actually the theory of securitization is 1/4 of the canid structure. It is the part where I see what did the discourses mean for the security environment, and that is when the security studies comes into the play, for example, in the form of the securitization theory. So it is only one part. The securitization theory portrays one part of how the discourses develop.
And this canid model is your creation?
It is, yeah. In the dark of the night, it is my creation, for 4-step creation, and it was basically knowing that from my own background, I needed to have a very simple and strong, robust structure to base my study on, to get rid of all possible biases, knowing that when it's a qualitative study, it is a lot about interpretations. So in every step I got rid of a bit more of the biases, hopefully that the actual conclusions are not bias-free, but lesser on the bias side.
Yeah. I was going to ask this later, but let's just tackle it now quickly. I mean, these are obviously subjects which, certainly in the UK, people find it very hard to talk about them objectively, because you either thought the government was, awful in the way that it portrayed the Iraqi threat, and the way in which it invaded a sovereign state, and the way in which it used intelligence material in a public manner to convince the public of a threat which, successive government reviews have said actually wasn't like that. So it's very hard to talk about that objectively. Snowden, similarly, people generally have a view on whether he was right or wrong. And whether he was right or wrong is almost separate to whether his information was bad, immoral, unethical, etc. So how do you analyse these things objectively?
Well, the people say that researchers have a way of ruining a good argument between people. So just like in cases like this, that you have two, when a researcher comes into a discussion, they kind of ruin the good fight spirit there with their lame arguments and objective views on the matters. So in a way, that is what was trying to be achieved. And knowing that the 2 cases were very fiery to begin with, so in many cases, whether in pub or international conferences, or when discussing with colleagues, or while doing the dishes, I had to say that I am not studying what happened with Snowden. I'm not studying what happened with Iraq as such. I am studying what was said in the media about the case, especially relating to the intelligence community, and that way I could distance myself from the actual events. And I think I might have written down a few times in the thesis that I am not trying to figure out what went wrong for example, with Joint Intelligence Committee and its assessments. I wasn't studying that. I was studying a different dimension of the case.
Yeah, and I think Iraq is easier because I think you would not find anyone now that would defend the action. Snowden, I think, is still very different, and is very different depending on who you ask, but also culturally which countries you ask. I mean, I think the only example, which is towards the bottom of page 1, where I think you slightly slipped into a biased view, is there.
I hope I quoted it somehow.
I think it's your words, actually, but let's not dwell on that. But I think, I mean, Snowden is an interesting one, and from a UK perspective, you can have a view of whether what he did was, morally or ethically sound, and that's almost separate to a view of what the government was doing, whether that was morally or ethically sound. I think the sort of interesting footnote is in the UK, at least. When there was an inquiry into this, the view was that all of the actions had been approved in the fashion in which they should be approved. That doesn't mean you would agree that they're moral or ethical, but from a sort of oversight and accountability perspective, they were all approved in the correct manner, which I think is something interesting to note. Let me just go back to the methodology, though. So you use this phrase discourse a lot, and you use it in different ways. You talk about public discourses, assignment of discourses, nuances of discourses. What do you really mean?
In this one, when defining what I was actually trying to figure out from the media perspective, I used quite a narrow view of discourses. It was the reporting and the message in the media reporting that I assigned the word discourse into. That they did have, in some cases, they have it longer outlining or wider messages and just not in the specific reports as such. But it is, I use it in quite a narrow sense, the discourses, when I'm actually studying what were they saying, what was possibly, if I could find the implicit or explicit reasons why, what were they, or reasons or messages, what were they trying to achieve by their reporting, which is always difficult because we know that you won't read a newspaper and it starts off by saying that we will tell you this and we will tell you so that you would do this next, or you should think about it in this way. So in many cases it was really relying on interpretations when I was checking into the discourses that I was studying.
So does that mean that someone else could repeat this study entirely and come up with different conclusions if it's all in the interpretation?
That is the problem with qualitative study. It is possible.
Yeah.
But in order to at least make it so that if someone else took the same approach and used the same methodology that I was using, it wouldn't deviate that much from what I concluded. If we find that someday I will buy the person a bottle of whiskey, but that is my hope, that the structure that I created is somehow not forcing, but guidance to the way that, okay, at least the approach should be similar. But as we talk about qualitative studies, it's an interpretation. Somebody might interpret them in a different way.
Okay. And then just the last question or two on the methodology. Obviously the thesis is, when you get into the case study chapters, we'll talk about case studies in a minute, but the chapters use a huge amount of your qualitative analysis of the newspaper reporting itself. Did you have any challenges accessing these? Did you think about, for instance, trying to interview the editors of any of those newspapers? Were there any sources that you would have loved to have used but you just couldn't find?
I did. I have to admit that I did. In some cases, I thought I would love to hear more from what were they. For example, some co-editor or the chief of the certain presses, that it would would have been, but then I wasn't sure if I would be able, and especially in a case when we're talking about a comparative case, I would have needed to do it 8 times to get comparative results for 2 cases, for 4 newspapers, for both cases. So then I kind of stopped and said, okay, this is too worksome, and the results are, how do you say it, they are too unsure to proceed with that one. So then, and eventually when I was digging into the archives of these 4 newspapers, I did find, with one single small exception, I did find the information that I wanted. I did find the reports that I was looking for from their own online archives. So it didn't help me to go forward without having the interviews in place. Of course, it would be interesting in hindsight, or maybe for the future, to actually give this research to those former editors of those newspapers, and then go and talk with them, maybe in an interview format. That what are they thinking? How do they find my conclusions? Do they find something that they actually didn't mean, or how would they see my findings?
Yeah, I mean, moving on to the findings and the analysis, means you look at the Independent, the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian, which are the sort of 4 big, broadsheet newspapers in the UK, all with very particular political alignments. Now, I could be very nasty and say, as Monty Python said, this is stating the bleeding obvious. We know what the Independent will think of anything because they're quite left-wing, they don't like security, they think it's over the top. The Guardian is the same, the Telegraph and the Times are more right-wing, they're more in favour of these things. So there's part of me that thinks, this is a really interesting study, but it doesn't actually tell me anything I don't already know, because I could have predicted without reading any of their coverage what they'd have said about Iraq and what they'd have said about Snowden. How would you respond to that?
Well, this is a case of validation that I wanted to look at if it really was that way.
Yeah.
I knew when I picked those 4 newspapers, and I wanted to have them in a specific sphere. I knew the Guardian would be on the left flank, and then you go towards the Independent, and you move on to the Times and the Telegraph. Yeah. So I did have intentionally the spanning from left to right. And I wanted to see if how that affected the writing, or would it show in the writing, and especially when the 2 cases were so different from each other, that how were these leftist, liberal, or conservative right newspapers dealing with the issues? Yeah. And as I say in the conclusions, in one of the cases, in the Iraq case, the differences were much smaller than I thought. And then in the Snowden case, it was much stronger, the political affiliation, as I expected. Yeah. But then of course then you had to add that when the Iraq case was happening, you had Tony Blair Labour government, and then while Snowden was happening, you then had David Cameron's Conservative government. So even that one was affecting how you deal with it, and so it became a myriad of matrix. In the end, how to pick up what was actually there, but knowing that when I set off with the research, I knew that there is a political affiliation strongly, and that's why I actually chose them to actually verify that. Can I find a linear or a way of reporting that was going through both cases?
And was there anything surprising that you came across?
In only a few spots, especially with the Snowden case. Yes, there were a few points when maybe the division was a bit stronger than expected, and then, like I said, that the Iraq case was so strongly government-centered that I think that there also the division between the newspapers wasn't as strong. So that was, I was expecting vice versa of the things, kind of.
Which is quite interesting, and I think, again, I think if you were to do this again, to make those conclusions stand out a bit more would have been quite good. Did you find in any of the newspapers in any of the case studies? I mean, they're almost treated like they're homogenous. If you're writing for the Guardian, this is your viewpoint. Same for the others. Did you find within any one of the newspapers slight disagreements? I know some of them changed a little bit over time with different reports.
I think the Independent had a bit, especially in the Iraq case, there was a bit of moving there. And if I remember correctly, there was a Telegraph that, of course, being on the most right of these four newspapers, that they at some points, the criticism towards the government was a bit stronger, that it deviated a bit from the normal line of the newspaper, which was basically blaming the Guardian for risking British security for publishing Snowden data, but there were little blips in the Telegraph writing that was a bit surprising at times.
Yeah, what's interesting, I mean, I think it's fascinating the way you go through the extracts and you come up with the sort of canid typology of how these newspapers, but they're also very different, of course, because Iraq. As you go through, there are different events that release more information into the public, and so the newspaper coverage begins to shift as we learn a bit more. And I thought that's really interesting, and the way it's done is really interesting. And actually, again, in hindsight, I think if you'd have introduced those different reports and some of their findings, it would have sort of made the context a bit more easier to understand, I think, Similarly with Snowden, although Snowden was a bit different because, of course, from the outset there was this enormous deluge of secret information which was put into the public domain, and in a sense it was all there to start with. What was missing, though, from the Snowden one is a really interesting government report, which I don't think you cited at all, which was a report in 2015 called A Question of Trust by David Anderson, a lawyer, who's the independent reviewer of terrorist legislation. And I don't know if you've come across this report or not.
I think it was in the autumn 15?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. And the first question I think is, why is this a terrorist legislation review? Why is it interesting? What he did in that report, which is online, you can find it, it's a PDF, he looked at the impact of Snowden's revelations, i.e. on the intelligence operations that were ongoing, and how their public disclosure could affect terrorist operations. So he said, and I wrote it down, the opening up of the debate has, however, come at a cost to national security. The effect of the Snowden documents on the behaviour of some service providers, this was internet service providers, and terrorists alike has, for the authorities, accentuated the problem of reduced coverage and rendered more acute the need for a remedy. So in a very long report, basically he concluded that the revelations of Snowden have, in his mind, had a serious effect on the intelligence community's ability to monitor terrorists, because terrorists will know that certain modes of communication, for instance, the government is listening into them. And it would have been absolutely fascinating, and if you were to carry on with this, it would be great to see your analysis of something like that. And of course, the Guardian or the Independent might not believe that anyway, because that's what the government would say. But it would be really interesting, because for that report, I think it pitched the sort of understanding of this, saying, actually, this is not just someone who, morally didn't like what the government was doing. Here are examples, and in his report he gives actual examples, of where a terrorist operation, he argued, would not be possible now because the methodologies have been released. Yeah. So I think that's not really a question, it's a long-winded statement. But I think it would be really interesting to see a report like that. How did these four newspapers respond after that one? Because I think Snowden, it changes it a little bit.
There was interesting around this topic in 2015, in early 2015, there was a lot of discussion exactly about the things that how did the Snowden revelations threaten actually the intelligence collection or intelligence work. And in many cases there were all officials or practitioners turned scholars like David Omand, who was quoted in saying that how does he think that the ways of how intelligence collection is done is affected by the revelations, but already 100 years ago, in the 1920s, if I remember correctly, there was a case where a then Prime Minister actually gave the go-ahead to raiding some trade union offices in London.
Yeah, 1927.
Yeah, and then it failed, and then he came to the Parliament, and he was questioned that why did you do it, and he said that we actually had intelligence that we had picked up from the cables, revealing to everyone what they were doing. So in a way, there have been similar cases before, and in a way, there was a discussion also on the pages in many cases. For example, the Times and the Telegraph were referring to the Guardian as the problem, not so much as Snowden, because the Guardian published Snowden information and brought it out to public, and that's why they saw it as a threat to security, national security. Whereas the Guardian again was then countering these discourses, saying that okay, we're just publishing because we think this is a threat to privacy and the liberal democratic society. So in a way, that was especially in the Snowden case, I could find the opposing arguments from the left-leaning and the right-leaning press.
I mean, I think that's it's relevant, obviously, but it's also a slightly different area. And people have written about politicization, which, you know, after Iraq became synonymous with the government abusing information to further a particular political cause. Actually, if you look at politicization, you know, the Arcos raid you mentioned, there are lots of other examples where the government intentionally released intelligence material, sometimes where they unintentionally, naively released intelligence material. You know, prior to or just at the time of the Falklands in '82, a junior defence minister revealed in the House of Commons that British intelligence was reading Argentine codes, which was a very naive thing to say, clearly. But then there are other examples where stuff emerges unintentionally. There was a famous example of a senior British policeman who was photographed getting into a car coming out of Downing Street with his sort of papers on the outside like this, and a photographer with a good lens got the front page of this, and it revealed that the Prime Minister had just been briefed on a intelligence-led policing operation about a suspected terrorist cell, and because they were very worried that these people would bring their attack forward, the premises were raided that day or perhaps the next day, and nothing was discovered. So there are lots of examples of, you know, politicization, whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally, and how they have had an impact on security, but also the media representation of those. And so I think the model, I can see there are whole hosts of other ways in which you can develop these. Did you at any point, so the four newspapers, you know, you could say we can guess which way they're going to go because they're political alignments. You know, the counter to that and the sort of control in a scientific sense would have been to look at the BBC, which is, there are questions about the BBC, but, you know, usually it's held up as this is the objective, politically unbiased view of these things. Did you think to compare all of the scenarios here with how they were represented on the BBC as a sort of means of comparison? Because that would have been fascinating.
To be honest, no. I knew that I used BBC as BBC was playing a part in the Iraq case when they were releasing their reports that then caused the more reporting around certain aspects of the Iraq case. But in the very beginning, when I'm talking about how the newspaper media developed in the UK, that was kind of in point of interest for me. That okay, you have newspapers that, for example, Lord Northcliffe started the kind of revolution that okay, starting to use a big newspaper to push his own agenda towards people, and that's why I kind of stuck to the newspapers, because I had the basic assumption that okay, we have these newspapers, they are not only reporting, but while they're reporting, they have an angle that they want to drive. And that's why I stuck to those newspapers. in many cases where I was presenting something on the study, I got asked a lot, like, why aren't you talking about the sun? Why are you talking about tabloids?
Yeah.
And I had to tackle the questions that, okay, I wanted to choose first of all, I wanted to choose sources, primary sources that are somehow comparable to each other, and that's why I stuck to the four newspapers. And since the big broadsheets at least used to be kind of informative in their approach, so it was easy to keep up with those, that they are not leading with images of we know what, and that they are that way they are apart from the way the tabloids used to be. Of course, nowadays everyone's going to the tabloid format, but the tabloid contents were the ones that were dividing these four, in my opinion, and that's why I stuck to those. Of course, I was referring at some times to some other media to check if there was actually something worthwhile to study and picking a checkpoint, but otherwise I kept to those newspapers.
One more question on this, and then I want to turn to sort of conclusions and final things. So one of the interesting things I think in the UK is that, generally speaking, the public, like the intelligence community, think they do a good job, respect what they do, and not critical. I mean, clearly there are some people that are, but generally speaking, that's the case. On the other hand, the public generally distrust politicians. I mean, now more than ever, but let's not go there. But so one of the questions I have is the model you develop here. I mean, I think there are different questions about this. So take Iraq, for example. You know, there's the question of whether the intelligence community simply got its assessments wrong, then led to the government doing what they did. There's the question of whether the intelligence community should have allowed their secret assessments to be used politically, you know, to further a political view. There's then separate questions about whether the government was right to use intelligence in a public, you know, forum. There are questions about whether the government was right in saying the intelligence assessments say this, and therefore the only possible response is to go to war. So my point is there are sort of, you know, even in the coverage of Iraq alone, there are subtleties in this, and the population generally will have a different view of the intelligence world to the politicians themselves. Does your candid model, is it sort of sophisticated enough, if you like, to pull apart the differences in that reporting?
I think it is, and it all comes down to the thing that what I say, that the variant in the candid model is the last part. You can pick some other theory or approach than securitization theory into the fold, and that's why I think that it's like a modular platform for a study, that you can alter some of the bits when you keep the basic structure as it is. And when I was trying to do the difficult thing and defining intelligence in the beginning, I wrote, and I still think that it was essential from the point of view of this study to understand intelligence as something that is helping. It is not a power as such, or state power as such. It is helping to guide the state power by, as I think it was quoted earlier, reducing ignorance in whoever is the decision maker. So when you bring it into that form, that it makes a part of the decision making, then you come to the point, how is it used as a part of the thing? Yeah. And then you come to the lifelong argument that an intelligence failure, is it really an intelligence failure? Is it a policy failure? Or is it a combined mess in the end? Okay.
Just for the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes or so, I want to just look at your conclusions and ask you some points to reflect on some of those. So, you know, coming back to the question I asked at the beginning, the development of the intelligence-media relationship in Britain, I still think this doesn't quite do that, because it doesn't look at that relationship. But just to comment on the relationship itself, you know, how has this whole question changed since 2003? You know, we've got 2003, we've got the Snowden revelations, technology has changed, social media has now come in. You know, the war in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw, as we now know, the sort of government not leaking, that's the wrong phrase, releasing little bits of the intelligence intentionally, I think, so that Putin knew that we knew what he was doing and all the rest of it. And there's an interesting article by the then chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee about this a little bit. And of course now we see, which is totally novel in the UK, defence intelligence every bloody day issues maps and daily tweets of what's going on. So how do you see this relationship having evolved over time, and where might it go into the future?
I think the biggest thing about the relationship is that it is understood better now. From the beginning, when it was at times very confrontational, I think the both sides understand each other a bit better nowadays. And in my in the conclusion pages, I do have a four-way hypothesis of which way it might go, because you can have either the media will start being more critical in their approach to intelligence community, or they could go into a more supportive journalism, and then again the intelligence community might close up, it might become more closed and secretive, or it might consider more transparency and more let's say cooperative work with publicity as a wide thing, and then of course with media. And at the time, I think, like I've written, that the progress is quite moderate, but it is heading towards that. There is still much of what is remaining secret, but the media reporting, especially in Britain, and looking at these two cases, has developed into a stage where it is, even though it is more critical, but it is critical in a constructive way. So it is not just the full blockage and you're wrong, but the understanding has developed, and the issues that are brought up considering intelligence communities are much wider than they used to be. So the interconnections between different issues are better understood and brought forward. So in a way, I brought to Tony Campbell's paradigms up from the oversight towards the keeping at arm's length. That if the relationship is going to legitimacy through regulated transparency, it is mutually beneficial, and if that is understood in a right way, it also enhances the accountability, because it is understood better, the relationship and the action as it is.
So should the intelligence agencies have their own press offices? Because at the moment they do not.
Why not? But then in a case where if you have, even for normal armed forces, when you have a PR person that is balancing on the ledge between inside the relationship, it needs to be somebody who understands enough of both sides, so that you, for example, you understand what the media needs are. Why are they reporting from a certain? Why are they having an approach like this? And then also understanding of what can be released, what is useful to share, what is. Well, we come back to the regulated amounts of information, but not from a point of view where it is trying to give the dogs little tidbits to keep it happy, but to actually see that what are the benefits of what kind of reporting. But it is a very, like in the 1900s, it was viewed that it's a very narrow path. You can easily step into the mud when if you try too hard to control what is said, it is likely to end up in a counter-effective way.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is the more you bring outsiders in, the less they become objective, or the less chance that people see what they're doing as objective. So that balance is crucial. So my very final question is, my final two questions. It's like the Spanish Inquisition. My final two questions are, can you apply these findings other liberal democracies? Are there lessons that come out of this? And secondly, that was 2 questions, so then my third question is, where do you go from here? What's next?
I do think they can be applied. I have had discussions with colleagues from different places, and that there are theoretical aspects here that are general enough that they can be applied. And I think the media is such a global phenomenon in contemporary age that it is having the same things that make the same drivers everywhere. And I think the only thing that was actually said, even when regarding the whistleblowers and Snowden, that then you have to think of, okay, you have what we think of liberal democracies versus authoritarian societies, that then you make the difference that when society doesn't function in a similar way, that then you start having collisions with the theory that it doesn't proceed. And where to go next? I would like to continue on this topic in a way that maybe, like you proposed, that when eventually turning this into an article format for a wider reach, it might be beneficial to try and get some kind of response from media houses that just to reflect on my findings, because it might give it a bit, even if they were disagreeing, I think from an academic point it would be more robust output from my part if I had.
Yeah.
Because if there is any kind of constructive criticism, it's never wasted. So in a way to add an additional voice to what I found, I think it would be beneficial to proceed. And I think that might be the next step to continue on this path.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Okay, stand up.
Please.
Well, I'm glad everyone is still with us. Feels like a very strange two-way conversation in a room full of people. So, ladies and gentlemen, Olli, as the opponent appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defence University, I've examined the dissertation of the doctoral candidate from weapons of mass destruction to Snowden and beyond, development of intelligence-related discourses in British media, which is obviously your different title again, but anyway, similar enough, in this public examination. The aim of the dissertation, as we have heard, is to explore how the British press, specifically the 4 mainstream newspapers, viewed the role of intelligence and policy in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, as well as the disclosures of the American intelligence contractor and traitor, Edward Snowden. Olli approached these subjects in 2 ways. Empirically producing an analysis of the newspaper reporting, which you refer to as canid, but also relating this to securitization theory. In my mind, the thesis makes 2 significant additions to the growing intelligence studies literature. Firstly, it provides the most detailed analysis that I have seen of the British newspaper reporting of both episodes. In some ways, those are not surprising, as we've discussed, because the political outlooks of those newspapers were obvious from the start. The main media outlets in the UK are politically aligned, and so the nature of their reports, their stances towards the government, sort of reflect what we would expect of them. But I think the value of the thesis is in analysing those much more seriously in the sort of holistic fashion. And the value of the thesis confirms this in a detailed and illustrative manner, but especially the qualitative analysis and the breakdown of this into the 4 areas: explanatory, questioning, supportive, and critical. The empirical detail and the qualitative analysis contribute to the second big value of this thesis, the manner in which 2 historical case studies
are utilised to support the social scientific analysis, as we discussed. Intelligence studies has been for a very long time sort of divided into two camps, and they don't often meet in the middle. Where academics have tried to make social science or theoretical contributions, it's generally been in areas where they lose any sort of practical benefits. They become so theoretical, they're sort of, exist in the clouds where no one in the real world exists. That's not to say, of course, that intelligence studies as a discipline is designed to improve the work of governmental agencies, but nonetheless, the further that academia strays into theoretical terrain, the risk is it becomes much less useful or valid. This thesis supports those efforts and paves the way, I think, for much more work in this area, whether it's applying the theory to other case studies, to other countries, etc. Indeed, I liked throughout the thesis, and certainly in the last chapter, how you stepped back from the details of Iraq, how you stepped back from the details of Snowden, and think about it on the impact of intelligence studies as a discipline, but also that media-intelligence relationship. These significant contributions aside, I also felt there were a number of areas where the thesis could have been improved, and if you turn it into a book or an article, I think that there are areas I would ask you to sort of, ponder about. The first and the most obvious, I think, is the thing I've mentioned a few times, that I don't think this actually looks at the relationship. It's a one-dimensional perspective, which I don't mean in a critical way, but it's the media's portrayal of the intelligence communities. It's not the intelligence community's portrayal of the media or its relationship. And I think it is also not about the media broadly, it's about newspapers. And so I think, that's something to look at. I think the other area where you sort of underplayed yourself, where you were a bit too shy and, didn't shed your inhibitions, was I think your conclusions could have been much stronger. You really could have said much more explicitly, this is new, this is original, this really enhances and furthers our understanding of things, and really been a bit more bold and sort of brave, I think, in some of those. But nonetheless, I think, what this really does show is how IR, in a broad sense, and empiricism can meet somewhere in the middle, and I think it makes a really very significant contribution. The importance, in a sense, is the so what question. We've read 100 and whatever it is pages, and we've had 90 minutes of questioning. So what? What does all of this tell us? What lessons emerge from the case studies? How can we encapsulate those in securitization theory that will provide useful ideas for the future? And I think that's very much what we've discussed and how it will move on. It's 10 years, of course, since Snowden spilled the beans. Technology has moved on. The media has moved on. So how does your thesis support our understanding? Well, I think we've heard lots about that over the last couple of hours. So as a summary, I think this is a very, very significant contribution to the intelligence studies literature, and I would therefore propose to the National Defence University that this dissertation is accepted. Thank you very much.
Distinguished opponent, Professor Goodman, Michael, thank you for your kind words and remarks. I will take these into my heart, and as we discuss now, as the studies continue, I will take into consideration how to make it better and more robust in the conclusions section, and proceed with these thoughts. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
If anyone present wishes to make any comments or has any questions concerning my dissertation, please ask the custos for the floor.
So, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, now you have an opportunity to pose questions for the candidate, and those who follow this event online, you can send your questions to Maanpuolustuskorkeakoulu at mil.fi. You should now see the email address in your screens, and we'll wait for a few moments for possible online questions. Joten nyt, hyvät naiset ja herrat, teillä on mahdollisuus esittää kysymyksiä tutkimuksen tekijälle, majuri Olli Teirilälle, ja etäyhteyksien ääressä olevat voivat lähettää kysymyksiä osoitteeseen maanpuolustuskorkeakoulu@mil.fi. Ja jotta kysymyksen tekijöille on mahdollisuus kirjoittaa kysymyksensä, odotamme hetken aikaa mahdollisia kysymyksiä. Ja katselen samalla myöskin paikalla olijoita, mikäli joku tahtoo tekijältä jotakin kysyä. Muutaman 10 sekunnin piinallinen hiljaisuus. So it seems that we have not received any online questions or comments. Kysymyksiä ei näytä olevan. Let me now inform you that any official observations about this dissertation or its examination shall be made to the National Defence University within 2 weeks from now. And those who wish to file such an official remark concerning this dissertation or its defence, please raise your hand now. Otherwise you will lose your right to make such an observation. Mikäli joku haluaa tehdä virallisen huomautuksen väitöskirjaan liittyen tai tähän tarkastukseen liittyen, sitten tulee ilmoittaa nyt tässä tilaisuudessa ja jättää huomautus 2 viikon kuluttua tästä päivämäärästä. Haluaako joku tehdä huomautuksen? Is anyone willing to file a remark about this thesis or its defense? I don't see anyone willing to do so. Kukaan ei näytä haluavan jättää huomautusta. So thus I hereby declare this examination closed. Julistan tämän väitöstilaisuuden päättyneeksi. Wait, please back up.